The HOA thought they could steal my land and get away with it, but the flood proved otherwise. And if you think this was wild, wait until you hear what happened when another HOA tried to fence me out of my own driveway. The land beneath their feet in the quiet outskirts of a growing suburban development, where cul-de-sacs stretched out like the fingers of a hand, there existed a wide tract of land that most residents never gave a second thought. It was bordered by a line of tall trees where an old fence once stood, and beyond it lay rolling hills, a winding creek, and a dam that had been built decades ago. The land belonged to one man, an inheritance passed down through generations, unbroken by sales, untouched by the expansion of suburbia. That man was me. Unlike the families moving into their prefabricated homes with neatly landscaped lawns, I had no interest in suburban comforts. My connection to the land was deeper, tied to memory and bloodline. My grandfather had built the dam, not for commerce or show, but to preserve the creek that once threatened to wash out the valley. His hands had laid the stone, his sweat had shaped the walls, and for years, it had stood as both protection and a symbol of endurance. But in the eyes of the homeowners association, the land was nothing more than an opportunity waiting to be seized. At first, it began innocently enough. Surveyors appeared on the edges of the property, their measuring poles cutting into the horizon. They spoke little, scribbling notes and disappearing before I could ask what they were doing. Then came the letters, envelopes with embossed HOA logos stuffed with demands, requests for access, insinuations of boundaries being unclear, and finally, claims that my land had been unutilized for too long. I ignored them, thinking it a passing nuisance. Yet, while I turned my attention to maintaining the dam, trimming the trees, and keeping the creek from flooding, something larger brewed behind closed doors. The HOA had been expanding, snapping up parcels of land, cutting deals with developers, and, eventually, laying foundations where they did not belong. It was not until I walked the ridge one morning and looked down into the valley that I realized what they had done. Concrete slabs sprawled across my property like scars. Framing beams rose into the air, and bright flags marked the corners of plots that did not exist on any deed they could legally claim. They were building homes on my land. At first, disbelief kept me frozen. I stared at the construction crews, their machinery grinding into the earth, their laughter echoing in the air, as if they had every right to be there. But disbelief turned quickly into rage. I pulled the deeds from my safe, tracing the signatures and stamps that proved my ownership. My grandfather's name was etched on the earliest one, followed by my father's, and finally mine. There was no mistake. The land was ours, and now mine alone. The HOA, however, acted as if none of that mattered. When I confronted them with paperwork, they dismissed me. They waived contracts with developers, claimed jurisdiction, and spun tales of imminent expansion. They argued that the land had been abandoned, despite the fact that I lived on its border, tended it, and preserved it for decades. They saw me not as a rightful owner, but as an obstacle. Within months, what started as a few concrete slabs turned into rows of houses, 35 in total, shiny new homes with vinyl siding, double garages, and lawns imported by truckload. Families moved in, oblivious to the theft that had occurred beneath their feet. Children played in yards that were not theirs. Cars lined driveways built on stolen soil. And all the while, the HOA paraded around as if they had orchestrated a triumph. But what they didn't understand was that the land itself was alive with history and with danger. The dam, old but strong, still held back the waters of the creek. My grandfather had built it with the knowledge that the valley below was flood-prone, that without it, the houses and roads would be washed away in a single storm. I maintained it out of respect, but also out of necessity. It was the only barrier between control and chaos. And as I watched the HOA mock my claims, sending me threats of fines for trespassing on my own land, I realized something. They had not just stolen my property, they had built their precious neighborhood directly in the floodplain my family had protected for generations. The arrogance of their theft blinded them to the danger they had invited. But I knew every stone in that dam, every drop of water pressing against it, whispered the truth. The balance could be shifted, the flood could return. And when that realization settled deep in my bones, so did a thought I could not shake. If they had taken what was mine, if they had erased my rights with their signatures and lies, then perhaps it was time to remind them of what they had stolen. Not with paperwork, not with arguments in court, but with the very force of nature they had ignored. For as surely as the dam held, it could also break, and I held the key to its gates. The HOA's denial and my planned letters grew sharper in tone, their language shifting from polite requests to outright threats. Each envelope that arrived at my door carried the weight of arrogance, stamped with the HOA's seal like a badge of superiority. They accused me of fabricating deeds, of forging documents that had been in my family for generations. They claimed the county recognized their expansion rights and that any protest on my part would result in legal action. To them, I was nothing more than a squatter on my own land. The first time I received a notice of trespassing, I laughed bitterly. The paper, covered in official-looking letterhead, declared that I had no right to be on the very ridge where my grandfather once stood, to oversee the dam's construction. According to the HOA, those hills, those trees, and even the water flowing down from the mountains now belonged to them. Their entitlement had metastasized into delusion. When I confronted the county office, the truth became clearer and darker. Somewhere in the shuffle of permits and contracts, the HOA had convinced local officials that the land had been abandoned. False affidavits, doctored maps, and paid surveyors had erased my ownership on paper. My deed was still valid, but it had been buried under a mountain of bureaucracy that the HOA had engineered. It was theft in slow motion, dressed up in the language of progress. Meanwhile, the construction continued. What had once been raw earth was now paved streets. Streetlights glowed at night, illuminating homes that rose up where fields once lay. Families moved in quickly, eager for their slice of suburban peace. They decorated porches, planted flowers, and waved at each other like any other community would. They didn't know their paradise had been built on lies. The HOA reveled in the illusion. Their president, a woman named Deborah, though most simply called her Karen, behind her back strode through the new neighborhood like a queen inspecting her kingdom. She held clipboards during inspections, fined residents for mismatched shutters, and scolded children for riding bikes on sidewalks. She ran her little empire with a clenched fist, all while standing on soil that wasn't hers to rule. She ignored my warnings. When I tried to tell her about the dam, about the floodplain, about the danger, she waved me off with a smirk. She accused me of fear-mongering, of being bitter that progress had outpaced my family's relic of a property. To her, the dam was just an eyesore on the horizon, not the wall that kept her kingdom from drowning. But I knew better. Each time I walked the ridge and looked down at the rows of houses, I thought of the waters pressing against the dam. My grandfather's work had been strong, but even stone and mortar have their limits. The spillway, the gates, the mechanisms he designed, all of it was under my control. I alone decided how much water flowed into the valley. I alone determined how much pressure the dam could withstand. At first, my thoughts leaned toward the law. I considered lawsuits, appeals, and petitions. I thought of gathering neighbors who had been burned by the HOA's greed, forming alliances to challenge their power. But the deeper I looked, the clearer it became. The HOA's roots were too deep. They had bought influence, wrapped themselves in paperwork, and convinced the authorities of their false narrative. Any legal battle would drag on for years while they enjoyed the fruits of their theft. And so, my mind drifted elsewhere. If the HOA respected only power, then power was what I would use. Not the kind written on paper or stamped by a county office, but the raw, undeniable power of nature itself. They had stolen my land, but they had built their empire on the very thing they didn't understand: the creek, the floodplain, and the dam that kept it all in balance. I began studying the dam more closely. I checked the gates, oiled the mechanisms, and tested the flow. I watched how the water rose after storms, how it pressed against the stone with unrelenting force. I kept records, measuring levels, and noting weaknesses in the valley below. The HOA had built their streets without proper drainage, their homes without foundations deep enough to withstand a flood. They had built 35 houses in the shadow of disaster, blind to the danger that loomed above them each day as their threats grew louder. So did my resolve. I was no longer a man defending his land with words. I was a man preparing to remind them of what they had stolen, preparing to let the waters speak on my behalf. But such a plan required patience. The right moment would matter more than anything. A single storm could tip the balance, but the gates would decide how far the flood would reach. If I acted rashly, I could be blamed outright. But if I acted carefully, if I let the HOA's arrogance set the stage, then the flood would appear not as vengeance, but as inevitability. The water waited, the dam stood, and I held the key. What the HOA didn't know was that their denial, their arrogance, and their greed had built not just homes but the conditions for their own downfall. And soon, the land would remind them. The cracks began to show. The first signs came quietly, almost too subtle to notice. The dam, which had stood for decades without issue, began to groan under the weight of the season's rains. Small rivulets of water trickled along the spillway, finding paths they hadn't carved in years. I saw them as whispers of warning, reminders that the balance my grandfather had engineered could be tipped at any moment. But the neighborhood below went about its business as though nothing lurked. Above, cars rolled in and out of driveways, sprinklers hissed over manicured lawns, and children rode scooters along sidewalks that had been laid directly in the valley's natural drainage path. The illusion of safety was complete, and the HOA did everything in its power to maintain it. They hosted barbecues and block parties, Deborah walking the streets with her ever-present clipboard, enforcing rules with a smile that never touched her eyes. Residents whispered about her behind closed doors, but complied nonetheless. Few dared to cross her, and those who did found themselves fined or humiliated. She thrived on control, never realizing that true control did not lie in fines or threats, but in the unseen wall of water that waited just beyond her reach. As spring storms swept through the region, the creek swelled. I monitored the levels daily, climbing the ridge to study the dam. Logs and branches piled against the gates, carried by rushing waters. The roar of the creek grew louder with each passing storm, echoing across the valley like a warning bell. I knew the danger, but I also knew opportunity. The HOA had taken my land, mocked my claims, and threatened me with trespassing charges for walking where my grandfather once stood. Now, they were about to reap the consequences of their arrogance. Still, I did not act recklessly. I kept my watch, documenting each rise in water level, each strain in the structure, preparing for the inevitable moment when all their lies would wash away. Meanwhile, cracks began to form not in the dam, but in the HOA's illusion of control. The first complaint came from a family whose basement had flooded. They blamed poor construction, faulty drainage pipes, and cheap labor. Deborah dismissed them with a fine for improper water management. But as the rains continued, more complaints followed. Yards became soggy swamps, driveways cracked under shifting soil, and mold crept up the corners of brand-new homes. Still, Deborah held firm. She sent out newsletters assuring residents that all was well, that their homes were safe, and that any problems were the result of negligence by the homeowners themselves. She blamed the victims, silencing dissent with penalties and public shaming. But beneath the surface, dissatisfaction grew. I watched it all unfold from the ridge, a silent witness to their unraveling. The HOA had built its empire on stolen land, and now the very land was rebelling. Yet they refused to listen, too blinded by pride to see the danger gathering above them. Then came the storm. Dark clouds rolled over the mountains, swallowing the horizon. Thunder cracked like cannon fire, and rain fell in sheets so thick the world blurred. The creek swelled rapidly, its roar louder than I had ever heard. Water surged against the dam, pressing with relentless force. The gates strained, the spillway foamed, and I felt the ground tremble beneath my boots as I stood watch. Below, the neighborhood cowered. Lights flickered in windows, cars splashed through flooded streets, and residents cursed the weather, never realizing the true danger that loomed. Deborah sent out a late-night email demanding that residents stay calm and avoid unnecessary panic, but her words rang hollow. The water was rising, and with it, the truth they could no longer deny. As dawn broke, the storm subsided, leaving behind a valley drenched and battered. The homes bore the scars: mud-streaked siding, waterlogged basements, and ruined landscaping. Yet even then, Deborah insisted all was fine, calling it a natural inconvenience. She refused to acknowledge the dam, refused to admit that their paradise had been built in a floodplain, but I knew differently. The storm had been only a taste. The water still pressed against the dam, higher than ever before. The gates groaned, begging for release, and standing there, I realized the truth. I didn't need to break the dam. Nature would do it for me. All I had to do was choose when. The cracks in the HOAS authority were widening, and soon the flood would do the rest. The breaking point storm had left its scars, and though the skies cleared, tension in the neighborhood only deepened. What had once been whispers behind closed doors was now open frustration. Families who had sunk their savings into these new homes realized that their so-called paradise came with waterlogged foundations and walls streaked with mold. The glossy veneer of suburban perfection was cracking, just like the concrete driveways laid on unstable soil. At HOA meetings, Deborah's voice grew sharper, her control slipping. She scolded residents for overreacting, accused them of poor maintenance, and blamed their woes on everything except the truth. Each time someone mentioned the flooding, she deflected. Each time a resident brought up the possibility that the land itself was unstable, she silenced them with threats of fines or lawsuits. But authority born of fear cannot survive once fear turns to anger, and anger was spreading like wildfire. One evening, as I stood on the ridge, I watched the neighborhood below seethe with discontent. Homeowners gathered in driveways, no longer hiding their grievances. Some argued loudly. Others muttered bitterly as they pointed at cracks in their walls or at standing water pooling in their backyards. The HOA newsletter, once regarded as law, now served as fuel for ridicule. Deborah's assurances of safety rang hollow against the soggy ground beneath their feet. It was then that my plan began to take shape in earnest. The dam loomed above them, unchanged yet ominous. The storm had filled its reservoir nearly to the brim. The gates, though sturdy, were old, and the weight of the water pressed against them with relentless force. I had checked the mechanisms that morning. With a single pull of the lever, I could release enough water to overwhelm the valley in hours. I could send a surge cascading down the creek bed, flooding the streets and homes that had been stolen from me. The temptation was fierce, but I was not reckless. Timing mattered. A flood unleashed at the wrong moment would be chaos without message. But if unleashed when the HOAS lies collapsed, when the residents realized the truth of their vulnerability, it would not be vengeance alone. It would be justice delivered by the land itself. Meanwhile, Deborah doubled down. She patrolled the streets with her clipboard, handing out fines for trash cans left out too long, for hedges trimmed unevenly, for fences painted in the wrong shade. She wielded rules like weapons, desperate to remind everyone that she was in control. Yet her eyes betrayed her. Behind the sharp tone and the tight smile was fear. She knew her empire was crumbling. Then another storm came, not as fierce as the last, but steady. Days of rain swelled the creek once more, and the ground, already saturated, had no room left to absorb it. Yards became lakes, basements filled. Again, and the complaints grew louder. Residents demanded answers. They demanded solutions. And for the first time, they turned on Deborah in public. I heard about the meeting secondhand, from whispers carried up the hill. They said she had lost her temper, screaming at homeowners who questioned her. They said she called them ungrateful, threatened to revoke privileges, and even accused some of conspiring against her authority. The crowd, once cowed into silence, erupted into shouts. Neighbors who had never dared speak out raised their voices in defiance. The HOA was no longer united. The spell was breaking. As the unrest grew, so did the tension in the dam. The water line edged higher, lapping at the gates. With impatient fury, I checked the pressure gauges, felt the tremble in the stone, and knew the time was nearing. The land had been patient, but patience has limits. The breaking point had come for the HOA, and soon it would come for the homes they had stolen. I stood on the ridge, the lever within reach, and waited for the final crack to split their illusion. Wide open, the flood unleashed there was heavy that morning, thick with the kind of stillness that comes before disaster. Clouds pressed low against the mountains, and the scent of rain lingered even though the sky had not yet broken. I stood at the dam, my boots planted firmly on the stone, and listened to the relentless roar of the water pressing against the gates. The reservoir was swollen to its limit. Any further rise, and nature would choose the moment for me, but I preferred to choose it myself. For weeks, I had watched the HOA unravel. Deborah's authority had crumbled under the weight of angry residents and mounting damage. Her threats carried no weight anymore. Her clipboard was just a piece of paper in a storm she couldn't control. Families whispered about lawsuits, about walking away from their homes, about exposing the fraud that had led them there. The once pristine neighborhood was now fractured, broken by mold, flooded basements, and distrust. The time had come. I pulled the lever. It moved with a groan, the sound echoing like thunder. The gates shuddered, and then, with a surge of force, the water rushed forward. It spilled out of the reservoir, crashing down the spillway, frothing white and violent as it roared. Into the valley below, the creek, once a gentle ribbon of water, became a raging torrent, devouring everything in its path. From the ridge, I watched as the flood descended. It moved swiftly, swallowing lawns, filling streets, and surging into the foundations of the 35 homes that had been built on my land. Cars bobbed like toys in the current, fences snapped. Like twigs, the water surged into basements and through doorways, rising higher and higher until the neighborhood's illusion of safety was drowned beneath the truth. Panic erupted. Families scrambled to gather belongings, rushing children into cars that stalled in the rising flood. Shouts echoed across the valley, blending with the roar of water. Neighbors who had once smiled politely at each other now screamed in desperation, their unity shattered by survival instinct. And at the center of it all was Deborah. I saw her on the steps of her house, clipboard still clutched in her hand as though it could shield her from the water. She shouted at residents, ordering them to remain calm, insisting that everything was under control. But her words were drowned out by the torrent, her commands meaningless in the face of nature's power. The same authority she had wielded so ruthlessly dissolved the moment the water touched her doorstep. The HOA was no more. Within hours, the neighborhood was unrecognizable. Streets had become rivers, lawns had turned to swamps, and the once pristine homes sat half submerged, their siding peeling under the weight of the flood. The pride of the HOA, their victory over me, their theft of my land was erased in a single surge. The residents, dazed and soaked, gathered on higher ground, staring back at what remained of their homes. Some wept openly, others cursed, and many simply stood in silence, unable to process the destruction. The truth had been laid bare. They had been deceived, sold a dream on land that was never safe to build upon. I watched from the ridge, unseen, my heart a mixture of satisfaction and sorrow. The flood had not been blind vengeance. It was the land reclaiming itself, the creek returning to its natural course. I had merely given it permission. The HOA had stolen what was mine, ignored every warning, and mocked the danger they lived above. Now they understood. But even as I stood there, watching the waters reshape the valley, I knew this was not the end. The flood had destroyed the homes, but it had also sparked something larger. Questions would be asked, blame would be thrown, investigations would begin, and in those investigations, the truth of the HOA's theft would come to light. The water had washed away their empire, but the reckoning was only just beginning. The reckoning when the floodwaters receded, they left behind more than wreckage. The neighborhood was gutted, a skeleton of its former self. Streets were choked with mud and debris. Lawns, once obsessively manicured, had become wastelands of silt and standing pools. The houses, proud monuments of suburban conformity, stood, broken and waterlogged, their drywall swollen, their foundations cracked, their promises shattered. The families had scattered, some taken in by relatives, others left stranded in hotels or temporary shelters. But displacement was only the beginning of their ordeal. Insurance adjusters arrived, clipboards in hand, but most shook their heads grimly. Policies didn't cover flood damage on land improperly zoned for development. Words like act of God and misrepresentation were tossed around. Homeowners who had sunk their life savings into their dream houses now realized they were Holding worthless shells, whispers grew into formal complaints, and soon the first lawsuits were filed. What began as scattered legal skirmishes quickly snowballed into a full-scale war. Class action suits emerged, naming the HOA, the developer, and Deborah herself as defendants. Evidence surfaced of falsified permits, concealed floodplain maps, and backroom deals that had allowed the neighborhood to exist in the first place for years. Deborah had wielded her clipboard like a scepter, issuing fines and decrees with untouchable arrogance. But now she was the one being summoned, dragged into courtrooms under oath, her voice trembling as she tried to explain away the lies. The sharp, commanding tone that once silenced neighbors now faltered under the weight of cross-examination. Each new revelation chipped away at her credibility until she stood exposed, not a leader, but a fraud. Neighbors who had once feared her turned against her with vengeance. Families who had paid thousands in fines testified about harassment. Others revealed how they had been pressured into silence when they raised concerns about flooding. The community that had once been her kingdom had united against her, not under her rule, but in defiance of it. And through it all, I remained silent, unseen. My name was whispered occasionally, as rumors swirled about the old owner who had warned them all. Some claimed I had orchestrated the flood, others dismissed it as conspiracy. But the truth was simpler. I had given the land back its voice. The dam had spoken louder than I ever could. The courts eventually rendered their judgment. The HOA was dissolved, its charter revoked, and its remaining funds seized to pay restitution. Deborah herself faced criminal charges: fraud, misrepresentation, and even reckless endangerment. Once the most powerful figure in the valley, she now sat small and broken in a courtroom, stripped of authority and facing the consequences she had long evaded. As for the land, it returned to me in a way no contract could have guaranteed. The developers pulled out, the buyers fled, and the valley was left abandoned, scarred but free. Slowly, nature began its reclamation. Grasses pushed through cracked pavement. Saplings took root where driveways once gleamed, and the creek flowed, unchallenged, carving its way back to the course it had always known. I stood on the ridge one last time, watching as the ruins of 35 homes faded into the embrace of the earth. There was no pride in the destruction, only a solemn recognition of balance restored. They had stolen my land, mocked my warnings, and built their dreams on a foundation of lies. The flood had washed it all away, leaving only truth behind. Justice had come, not in the courtroom, but in the water's rise and fall. The HOA had thought themselves untouchable, but in the end, they were nothing more than trespassers in a place that could not be tamed. And as the valley grew quiet once more, I knew this chapter was over, but I also knew it would not be the last. Time, power, greed, and arrogance would collide with the stubborn voice of the land. Because when you build on stolen ground, nature always waits for its reckoning.